All right, well, good morning. We are glad to be here. Good to see so many of you here with us. I know we have some that are absent due to traveling, and I know we have some that are out due to illness and recovery from procedures and different things. So let's be mindful of them and take note of who is not present. And if you get the opportunity, try to maybe reach out and encourage them as you have the opportunity to do so. When we think about the church, there are different things that we find throughout the writings of the New Testament that depict the church in various ways. And there are a lot of them, but one of them that I want to focus on today, and just this one only, is the church being depicted as a kingdom. Now, when we think about a kingdom in the political or geopolitical sense, we may think about history, we may think about ancient history, we may think about in somewhat more modern times, and there are some nations in the world today that are still ruled to some degree by monarchs, by kings and queens. Not as common, but it does still happen in some places. And when we think about a king, we may think about one, and we define the term as one who is as sovereign over a specific geographical area. But for there to be a king, there must be a kingdom for one to rule over. And the kingdom is, of course, in the same definition, would be the domain of the king, those who are subject to the king. Throughout history, many kings have ruled through sheer force of will, violence. They come to the throne through hereditary monarchy, that is, being passed down in one family from one generation to the next. And we see when we come to the scriptures, we see kings and kingdoms, especially in the Old Testament. But ultimately, when we think about the Old Testament and when we think about the reigns of David and Solomon, all of it is looking ahead to the King of Kings. And that's some of what we're going to look at this morning. And so I'm going to have some different passages here for you, for your consideration. But the main thing that I want us to understand is that this depiction of the kingdom is relevant in many ways to our understanding of the church. And so I want us to see that relevance here this morning. So the first thing, as we've already established, when we think about it, in order for there to be a kingdom, as I've already said, a king must be in place to rule over it. And I want us to think about, we're going to turn to Colossians chapter 2 and verse 10. And then another passage I'm going to give just for your consideration. But Colossians chapter 2 and verse 10, this is a passage that is relevant to this, but maybe not one that we think about as often. And here in writing to the church of Colossae, Paul, in speaking of Christ, simply says, "And you," that is the church, "are complete in him," that is Christ, "who is the head of all principality and power." Now, the other passage that I want you to just make note of and consider, of course, is Jesus' statement in Matthew 28 and verse 18 when he says, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth." And certainly for a king to rule, a king has authority. There is delegated authority. When we think about it with Jesus, he said, "Authority has been given to me," that is, delegated. But also, a king has absolute authority. When you look throughout history, when we think about secular history, in many cultures, and especially in ancient times, there was no elected legislative body like we have today here and in many other parts of the world. You had the king, and the king's word was the law without question. Jesus' authority is absolute. Now, we need to think about it as well. Unlike other kings who, as I mentioned, have ruled by violence and by force, his rule is different. And we'll talk about that as we go further into our study. But we also need to understand that the king's authority is one that is over his realm. Physical, earthly kings are only over a specific area. Even those who conquered in times past vast and large areas, their domain did not extend beyond what they occupied. But we think about Jesus, all authority in heaven and in earth. And make no mistake about it, his kingdom is the church. And we'll look at that as we go further into our study. And so we are subjects of him. But not only is a king one that exercises authority, but also there are many victorious kings. Again, you think about history and you draw those parallels, and we've perhaps studied history of kings who have conquered and, they returned from the battle victorious. And we see that as well with regards to Jesus. When we come to Revelation chapter 19, Revelation 19 and in verse 16, and this is one of the visions that John sees, and he's describing what he witnesses. We see the description beginning back in verse 12. But then we come down to verse 16. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he has, present tense, now. And the reason I make that distinction and I emphasize that is because there are many who are very confused about the nature of this. There are many who will say that the kingdom is yet to come, and they'll try to make it future. But here we see it in the present, and for that you can go back to verse 9 of Revelation 1, where John says that he is in the kingdom at the time in which these things were written. But nonetheless, we see here a victorious king, King of Kings, that is one who is over all others. And he is indeed victorious. He has proven to be victorious over sin. He has proven to be victorious over death. And in the end of all things, he too is going to be victorious and triumph over his enemies. And what a great and tremendous blessing that we have to be a part of it. So we need to remember that we are subject to his authority, but not only are we subject to his authority as his subjects, but we need to have confidence that he'll deliver us from sin and death. And we need to be confident in his ability to do so. We need to be subjects who trust our king. But secondly, in order for a kingdom to exist, That kingdom, as we've already alluded to, has to have subjects or citizens. Now, when we think about citizenship in the physical, again, political, geopolitical realm, one is a citizen of a country in one of two ways: by birth or by lawful migration. We have many rights and many great privileges with our physical, material citizenship. But we also need to remember that we are citizens of an even greater kingdom yet. We are citizens of it by adoption. Turn with me to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19. Ephesians 2 and verse 19. And we're going to look here at what Paul says. And really the context for this begins at earlier in the chapter. And I would encourage you and invite you to go and read those preceding sections. But I want us to come down to verse 19 when he's coming to the conclusion of this. He says, "Now therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners." I know that I have, and I know there are some of you as well that have traveled to other countries for various reasons: mission work, business, maybe even pleasure at different times. And while it's interesting to go and visit other places, anytime that I go out of the country, and I think specifically the 2 times that I've been to Honduras, one thing that always strikes me when I'm there is they are not the foreigners. I am. No longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. That's another descriptive term of the church, household of God. Yet another that we find. But here's the point. As Paul brings out in the preceding passages here in Ephesians 2, that is all made possible because of the grace of God. He has taken those of us who were once strangers, or that is separated from God, and because of that, through adoption, has brought us in. And what a great and tremendous blessing that is, because of his grace, because of his death, and in all of that, because of his great love. We are citizens of the kingdom. And we of all people are most blessed. But also being a citizen of a nation means assimilation, or that is adapting to the ways and the customs of the host nation. When we think about the church and when we think about the spiritual kingdom, we need to recognize that when we become part of it, it is, or it should be, a transformative experience. And consider with me again, we'll turn again to Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. We're going to notice what Paul says here. Colossians 1, 13 and 14. And speaking of Christ, he, that is Christ, has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed, other English translations will render that translated, us into the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. And he also makes similar reference in Philippians 3, verses 20 and 21, when he talks about our citizenship being in heaven. And so I would encourage you to study that passage in parallel to this as well. But when we think about transformation, when we think about assimilation, in order to do that, there have to be changes made. Again, drawing the parallel to a physical, earthly, material nation. If we go for an extended period into another nation, if we're going to do it right, we're going to have an understanding of this nation. Some may go ahead and try to learn the language of that nation. And we may become familiar with their customs and the way that they do things, so that while we are there, we can conduct ourselves as we ought and not create conflict or cause offense to our host. So when we think about that in the spiritual realm, when he says conveyed or translated us from the power of darkness, that is sin, and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. That's a translation, or a transformation rather, from the flesh to the spirit. And so when we think about going from the flesh to the spirit, when we're thinking carnally and in fleshly terms, we're by definition not thinking of the spiritual. And so when that transformation takes place, there's going to be a change in our thinking. We're going to think about and we're going to view and begin to understand things differently. And then with a change of thinking, there comes a change in conduct. Because if I'm thinking properly, I'm going to act properly. But we also need to recognize the reason for this transformation is because of the love that the King has for us. I said a few moments ago that at many times throughout history, many kings have ruled through sheer force and violence. But it's not like that in the Lord's kingdom, his church. He rules through love. He doesn't force us in, he invites us in. And there is a vast difference between force and invitation. And verse 14 of Colossians 1 explains how that is made possible. We have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sin. Being cleansed of that and having that transformation. And so when we think about this, and being transformed and adopted, we need to live in a manner that is worthy of that. Conduct that is becoming to reflect what it is that has been done for us. It's going to lead to a transformative life. It needs to be evident by the fruits that we bear. But that gratitude also needs to be demonstrated through our obedience. And we need to remember that as well. That there are expectations. And we're going to look at that here in just a moment. But our obedience comes not through fear of punishment or consequence, but rather it comes because of a demonstration of our trust and our gratitude for the love that has been done for us. And so that leads us to thirdly, that it is a kingdom that has boundaries. Let's go again to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 and verses 2 through 10. We won't read all of this, but I do want to consider a few things. First of all, he says in verse 1, be imitators of God as dear children. If we're going to be a part of a kingdom, then we need to understand that a king having all authority sets boundaries and expectations for what is and is not acceptable conduct for the subjects. So we can see here, 1, that we are to be imitators of God. Verse 2, we are to walk in love in that same fashion, as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. That is something that is pleasing. So we are to be imitators of our King. We're to follow his example. And then we look at verse 3. Here are the boundaries. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints. So there are certain things that just ought not to be done. Especially for those who have been conveyed or translated from darkness and into the kingdom. And he continues that. We look at verse 4, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. And then he gives the summary in verse 5. For this you know, that no fornicator, unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. We need to remember that just as there are things that we are to do, there are things that we ought not to do. And we need to examine ourselves, lest we be guilty of those things. But also, we need to remember that forgiveness is available for if or when we do come short of any of that. But he continues that through verse 10, and so you can read the rest of that for consideration. And so when we think about what we're to put off, we need to remember where to place our focus, and we are to place our focus on the things above. We go again to Colossians chapter 3 and verses 1 through 4. And here he is going to make that abundantly clear. If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on things of the earth. For you died, that is spiritually, you died to sin, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. We have an emphasis here on our focus. As subjects and as citizens of the kingdom, we are to look to our King. Here he tells us where he is. He tells us and emphasizes where we are to put our focus. But also here we have a promise. And the promise is this: that we will be with him when he appears. So we need to look at him, look to him. We need to look to what's to come. And we are to do it with, or should do it, I'll say, with great anticipation. As I've said many times before, for those who are found faithful, this is not something to dread, but rather something to anticipate. Because this will be the end of all things. So we need to follow the example that is before us, that is the example of Christ. We need to be mindful of not only our conduct, but I would also dare say of our associations. You go back again and you look at Ephesians 5 that we just read. Sometimes, even if we don't do it intentionally, we might be influenced by others. And so we need to be mindful and be careful and deliberate about our associations. And again, we need to look above and not around. But lastly, we need to remember that we are part of a kingdom that endures. This was an endurance that was promised. When you go back to the Old Testament and you go to the prophecies of Daniel and you go to Daniel chapter 2, and there in that context you'll find Daniel providing King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, an interpretation of a dream that he had. And the king describes in great detail this dream, and then he asks for the interpretation and the understanding of it. And Daniel does so. And he makes mention of other kings, and you go throughout there, and you go throughout other parts of history, secular history. And of course, at this time you had the Babylonians, and then after Babylon you had the Medes and the Persians, you had the Greeks, and then you had the Romans. And it's there that Daniel says that in the days of these kings, looking ahead to what was to come, that another kingdom would be established that would endure forever. It's a kingdom that's guaranteed in perpetuity, permanence. And again, we look at history, and we can see the pages of history filled with kingdoms and kings that are no more. Rulers, kings, kingdoms come and go, rise and fall. But we have an assurance and a promise of one that endures. But not only is it one that is going to endure because it's promised, but because of its very nature, we're in a kingdom that cannot be conquered by outside forces. Again, you think about history, and you think about all of those kings and nations, and how many times one has conquered and prevailed over another. But not so with the kingdom of heaven. But also, it is a kingdom that conquers. Now, I know there might be a little bit of an irony in that, and some might argue that maybe I just contradicted myself. But there's a difference between being conquered and conquering. And here's what I'm talking about. Again, many throughout time have relied on sheer force of will and violence to rule and to maintain their domain. But as we looked at a few moments ago, Revelation 19:16 is written his name, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And in that same context, in the verses preceding it, John tells us that he is a king and he goes forth to conquer. We need to remember that. He is going to prevail. He has and he will prevail over all the forces that this earth has to offer. There will come a day and there will come a time when each and every one of us will stand before him. And we will kneel before him. and we will confess him. Paul tells us as much in Philippians, that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. But also we need to remember that not only was the endurance promised, it has been fulfilled. One final passage that we'll look at is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 28. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 28. And here we find these very encouraging words. He says, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. A kingdom which cannot be shaken. But also within this, it's shown what we ought to be doing in the meantime. Serving with reverence and godly fear. Giving back to God what is due him. It's a demonstration, it's a heart of gratitude, it's a demonstration of gratitude, and above all, a reverent demonstration. So again, we need to remember that nations rise and fall, have risen and have fallen. Rulers will come and go, kings, presidents, prime ministers, and whatever other title that they might wear. They have and will come and go. But we need to remember that despite whoever it may be, and whatever period of time we're in, as part of the kingdom of his dear Son, as we looked at in Colossians 1:13 and 14, we are subject to a kingdom and a king that will never fail. And as I mentioned again a few minutes ago, it relies on invitation and not conquest. He invites us to be a part of it. He wants all to be a part of it, and I want to give you that same invitation and that same opportunity as well. To come in simple faith, believing that he is the Son of God, that he is the King of Kings. Believing that, confessing your faith in him, and being transferred into his kingdom, into his blood, through the waters of immersion for the forgiveness of sins. But maybe you have done these things, and maybe you realize that maybe for whatever reason you're not walking in the manner in which you ought to walk. That same blood still forgives. And he wants you to take advantage of that as well. And so do we. So if there's anything that we can do to help you this morning spiritually, we would invite you, and Dub is going to come and lead us in another song.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher